I was so pleased when I was asked to do this presentation because it's just such an important part of my life. And I really think that it's important to spread this information far and wide. So welcome. My talk is also called Recipe for Survival. Okay. So on Monday, as recently as Monday, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, came out with a brand new report. Their last one was 8 years ago. And this report that came out on Monday said, it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes have occurred. This is a fact. Many changes due to past and future greenhouse gas emissions are irreversible, especially changes in the ocean, ice sheets, and global sea level. And that's why I'm doing this talk today, because so often when we think about climate change, we think about emissions from cars, from planes, from our houses, from the electricity, and all too often we're not thinking about also what we eat. And so that's why I'm here. So one of the things I want to preface this with is a lot of us think about health as if we're human. Well, we are human, but a lot of us think about health in the human context. So I want you to think about, what if Earth were a patient? We would do everything possible to save her. We would give her oxygen to breathe, remove excess carbon dioxide from her lungs and blood, and decontaminate or detoxify her from the poisons and toxic sludge that have been building up over the years. We would cool down her fever and provide treatments to rehabilitate her after the years of harm she has experienced. We would do everything possible to give her a healthy and long life. Yet too often humans do not treat Earth and the species that live here as though she is such a patient who desperately needs life support. Instead, we continue to harm her with more toxins, including agricultural fertilizers, pesticides, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and other greenhouse gases. We tear down her cleansing mechanisms, including trees, algae, and phytoplankton, and we dehydrate her by pumping out too much water to feed the animals that humans want to eat. If Earth were a patient, we as a collective species would be failing her, but we can change that, and I'm going to explain how. So Albert Einstein is known for many things, but one thing that I like to attribute to him is the idea that nothing will benefit human health and increase the chances for survival of life on Earth as much as the evolution to a vegetarian diet. So to begin with, I want to kind of go over sort of the premise of today's talk. Like I said earlier, a lot of us think about climate change in terms of electricity, industry, transportation. But what we may not know is that agriculture produces roughly 25%, and depending on which site you want to source, it could be as much as 50% of all greenhouse gases globally. Now, 80% of that proportion of greenhouse gases comes from animal agriculture, primarily methane, and that's primarily from cows for dairy and beef. However, another 20% of that portion from animal agriculture comes from other animals as well. 20% of that 25% comes from deforestation, primarily in the Amazon, which releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and also removes carbon sinks, things that absorbs carbon. The population in 2021 is about 7.8 billion people. Well, average meat intake in the US is about 200 pounds per person per year. In developing countries, it's only about 62 pounds per person per year. And yet by 2100, it's expected that the population will be about 11 billion people. In these developing countries, meat intake is expected to increase by 50%. And why shouldn't it? I mean, they want to eat like we do as they get more income and more ability to purchase some of these foods that we consider commodities. Today, crops and pasture land use half of all the ice-free land on Earth. Therefore, it's inevitable more land will be needed to feed the growing world population. But we just don't have that much more land to use. And to make matters worse, the land that we do have is actually desertifying. A lot of this topsoil that is used to grow the foods that we eat and the foods that we use to feed animals is being wiped away. So what happens? How do we get more land? Deforestation. And this is what's happening in the Amazon and other forests around the world. It's very heartbreaking when you think about all of the trees that have been there for hundreds of years and now they're being cut down so that we can create more feed for a lot of the animals that we want to eat. And a lot of these animals are living in conditions called concentrated animal feeding operations, where there may be hundreds of these animals in one small house or one small plot of land, and they're eating corn and other crops that we are growing on these lands that we have now destroyed. A lot of the waste that comes from these CAFOs ends up running down into rivers and streams, and it pollutes fresh and marine waters with these chemicals and waste runoff, which can often lead to dead zones. In fact, the dead zones around the world are growing precipitously every year. What this image shows is a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, where unfortunately there's so much nitrogen and fertilizer and waste in the water that it basically kills everything that lives there. Another big source of emission is food waste. Globally, 1/3 of all food is wasted. Unfortunately, in the United States, 40% of all food is wasted, meaning it's thrown in the trash and goes to landfill, where it produces 3.3 gigatons of carbon every year, primarily from methane. Now, if food waste were its own country in red bar, it would be the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases after China and the United States. We could feed so many people with this food waste. Food waste also wastes precious water resources. Only 3% of water on Earth is fresh water, and agriculture uses 70% of this fresh water. And in developing countries, it can be as much as 90% of their fresh water. Now, I'm asked a lot, can fish be sustainable? Well, I don't think so. Over 90% of fish and fish stocks are fully exploited or overfished. 60% are fully exploited, meaning there's no additional room to grow and extraction. 34%, which is orange, are overfished. And in fact, this has gotten worse over the years, as you can see from the image. 6% of fish only today are underfished, and that's assuming the data that is coming in is accurate. In 2013, this level was 10%. So as you can see, we are drastically removing the number of fish in the oceans. A 2016 Food and Agriculture Organization report called Fish to 2030 stated that supplying fish sustainably, producing it without depleting productive natural resources and without damaging the precious aquatic environment is a huge challenge. We continue to see excessive and irresponsible harvesting in the capture fisheries and in aquaculture. In fact, several fish species have been declared critically endangered and threatened with extinction by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN. And this includes certain bluefin tuna populations, grouper, swordfish, and the Patagonian toothfish, which most of you probably know is the Chilean sea bass. So how does overfishing occur? Pretty much is the fishing methods, which often lead to high bycatch rates. So bottom trawling is when you have a ship and it's dragging a humongous net behind it on the bottom of the ocean floor, dredging everything in its path, and everything pretty much gets swept up and dies. There are purse seine nets, which go around a big school of fish and perhaps other animals, and then it cinches tight at the top and captures everything in it. There are gill nets, which are like a long curtain of nets. Anything that swims into it often gets caught by the gills or its arms, if it's its wings, if it's a seabird. And then of course, long lining, which is hundreds of baited hooks along miles of fishing line. There's also illegal fishing that happens where wealthier countries will send their fishing fleets to developing countries and fish in their waters off the coast. And unfortunately, they're depleting their waters of fish. So those who desperately need it in these developing countries no longer have that as an option. And then there's low efficiency aquaculture. And what that means is sometimes it can take up to 4 to 5 pounds of wild fish species to feed a carnivorous fish that humans like to eat, such as salmon. And we only get 1 pound of the salmon out from the aquaculture. So it's very inefficient. Now here's a quick video kind of demonstrating some of these things I just talked about with fishing.
The Earth. There are currently 7 billion people living on 30% of its surface, and all of them are dependent on the remaining 70%, the ocean. The ocean is the largest source of food in the world. Fish is the main daily source of protein for 1.2 billion people. But fishers are more and more frequently returning home with empty nets. Let's turn the clock back a little. Some scientists say that in the last 60 years, stocks of large fish have fallen by 90%. They are warning that we are facing the collapse of all types of fish species in less than 50 years. The reason for this? Overfishing. Longline fishing vessels deploy 1.4 billion hooks a year. 1.4 billion hooks, each with a slice of fish hanging from them as bait. There are trawling vessels that cast nets with an opening of up to 23,000 meters squared, the size of 4 football pitches, and big enough to hold 13 jumbo jets, or more commonly, more than 500 tons of fish. Amongst these 500 tons of fish, there is a lot of bycatch. Bycatch is marine creatures incidentally caught, often at large quantity. Typically, shrimp trawlers throw 80 to 90% of the marine creatures caught back overboard. This means that for 1 kilo of shrimp, up to 9 kilos of other marine wildlife is caught and wasted. To relieve the strain on wild fish, 47% of our seafood demand is farmed fish. But marine aquaculture is more of a nail in a coffin than a lifeline. Many of the farmed fish are carnivorous. That is, they eat other smaller fish. 5 kilos of captured wild fish are needed to produce 1 kilo of farm-reared salmon. Aquaculture just converts low-value small fish into higher-value bigger ones. It does not create more fish. The majority of European fish stocks are overfished. Historically, EU fisheries ministers have set fishing limits exceeding scientific advice. In 2008, fishing limits were defined for the highly prized bluefin tuna. Scientists recommended a fishing limit of 10,000 tons to rebuild the increasingly depleted population. However, the EU and other fishing nations decided on a fishing limit of 29,500 tons, 3 times what scientists had suggested. Then, despite this already inflated limit, 61,000 tons of bluefin tuna were caught. That is 6 times more than the recommended limit. Billions of euro in public subsidies are fueling this overfishing. If this continues, soon there will be no fish left. How do we end overfishing? Your politicians have the responsibility for making the decisions in Brussels that will end overfishing. Citizens have responsibility of encouraging and supporting their politicians to make those decisions.
Okay, so although that is a video out of the EU, this is happening all over the world. So it really is a global problem. Now, going back to the aquaculture, there are environmental impacts of CAFO-like aquaculture. And I call it CAFO-like because you have many fish in these small netted systems in natural environments. And what we see is there's environmental pollution from drugs and other chemicals that are being fed to these fish so that they hopefully stay healthy. There is spread of disease and parasites to wild fish because, again, they're being raised in a natural environment. There's entanglement of predators. So, for example, a shark sees this grouping of fish. It says, oh, I'm hungry and here's a fish I can eat. But unfortunately, it gets caught in the net. Then there's the use of wild fish as fish feeds, which I discussed earlier. And then occasionally you can get escaped fish, which compete with wild fish for both food and habitat. And this has happened in the Pacific Northwest, where farm-raised salmon escaped and unfortunately destroyed some of the habitat and feed for the wild fish that live there. And then, of course, pollution and waste from the captive fish that end up in the environment because there's really nowhere else for it to go. And just for your information, when it comes to omega-3s, I know we all hear about the healthful benefits of the fish-based omega-3s, but the Institutes of Medicine only have a reference intake value for ALA, which is the plant-based omega-3. And the reason for that is because we can synthesize DHA and EPA in our own bodies from ALA. And also DHA can be obtained from algal sources or algae. In fact, that's the primary producer of the DHA where fish get it. They eat the smaller fish that eat the algae. And this is already used in commercial products such as infant formula. It's called Crypthecodonium conii, and it's an ingredient in Enfamil. So if it's good enough for your baby, it's probably good enough for you. With regards to concerns of protein, because I'm asked that all the time, your average healthy woman really only needs about 50 grams of protein per day, and your average healthy man only needs about 70 grams of protein per day. And of course, that can vary depending on health status or illness or athletics, those types of things. So definitely, speak with a doctor or a dietitian if you have questions about how much protein that you need. But with that said, this graph basically demonstrates that there are plenty of plant-based foods out there that have plenty of protein, and you absolutely can get enough, if not more than enough, from plant-based sources. So, I like to say everything has a little bit of protein in it, which is true. Even your piece of fruit, even your apple might have a half gram of protein in it. So definitely easy enough to get it from plant-based sources. Now, plastic is another major problem. Just look around you. I bet there's something plastic in your line of sight. But modern plastics were developed in 1907. They were commercialized in the 1930s and 40s during World War II. By 1950, plastic production reached about 1.7 million tons per year. And today it's over 300 million tons per year. So there's been a 200-fold increase in the amount of plastic production. The global population has only increased 5 times. So what is happening with all this plastic? It's used in all types of consumer products, and plastics are made from oil, natural gas, and other petroleum-derived products. The problem with plastic is, though, that it persists in the environment for hundreds or thousands of years. And between 1.1 and 8.8 million metric tons end up in the oceans every year, where they're wreaking havoc. This graphic from our World in Data basically demonstrates how this plastic ends up in the ocean. And primarily, it's from the mismanagement of coastal plastics or landfill. And when it's in the ocean, unfortunately, that's what it looks like. Not very pretty. But even worse, it photodegrades because of UV in the ocean currents, and then they turn into microplastics. When plastics are in the ocean, they damage marine ecosystems, including coral reefs. They entangle and drown marine animals. They get consumed by marine animals. And they release toxins, persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, which bioaccumulate up the food chain. And in fact, 93% of Americans have been found with BPA residue in their blood. Right. And of course, there's unnecessary use of plastic. I mean, come on, bananas already come with their own natural packaging. Why do we need to then package them in plastic with plastic and more plastic? And these are some of the health effects that can happen with plastic that are known. So for example, bisphenol A, bisphenol S can have fetal or reproductive dysfunction, can be possible carcinogens. They can have behavioral or nervous system health effects or endocrine health effects. A lot of them may act like estrogen in the body. So how much plastic do we all use? Just think about it for a moment. A lot of us use more than 300 single-use plastic bags each year and roughly 200 single-use plastic bottles. Now, this did improve a little bit before the pandemic. And then, of course, once the pandemic hit, all bets were off and the use of single-use bags started going up again. But 7% of all plastics ever get recycled. The rest pretty much either ends up in the landfill or gets downcycled into other products such as park benches, flooring, and clothing. Now, palm oil is yet another issue. With palm oil, what we see is the clear cutting of forests in Indonesia and Malaysia. And what we're looking at in this image is on the left is the palm oil plantation, on the right is virgin forest that will probably be cut down if it hasn't already been cut down to create more palm oil trees. It's a driver of human-induced climate change, and it destroys the habitats of orangutans, Asian elephants, and Sumatran rhinos, all of which are endangered species. 20 companies are primarily responsible for this deforestation. And these are just a handful of the products that palm oil is found in. And this is what it looks like when an orangutan is displaced from its home because we want to eat palm oil, even if it's unknowingly. So where is palm oil found? It's found in packaged foods, ice cream, cookies, crackers, chocolate, cereals, breakfast bars, cake mixes, baby formula, dry soups. It's found in frying oils, and it's found in detergents and soaps under all of these various names. Unfortunately, our appetite for palm oil is only growing. In the image on the right, you see that in 2007, 2008, we were using about 41 million metric tons per year, and now we're using as much as 77 million metric tons, and it's still increasing. And what all this means is that we're losing biological diversity. And why that's important is because biological diversity, you know, the differences in DNA between the various animals on the planet and various species gives us more resilience. So when we lose this, we're losing our resilience. So in 1900, if we're talking about just global terrestrial mammal biomass, livestock accounted for about 2/3, humans about 1/6, and wild animals about 1/6. Fast forward to 2000, now livestock accounts for about 3/4 to 80% of terrestrial mammal biomass. Humans about 1/4, and wild animals are now less than 4%. But yet, when you look at the bottom graphic, what you see is that when you look at where is the DNA diversity, where is this biological diversity, more than 99% of it is found in wild animals, wild mammals. Livestock only consist of less than 1% of that biological diversity. So what we're doing effectively is replacing biological diversity with one species, a monocrop of animals, so to speak. So how can we be more sustainable? Now that I've given you a heads up on all the problems we're facing, which seem a bit insurmountable, I want to give you a few tips on how we can be more sustainable. First, we can be an informed consumer, eat more plants and crowd out the meat. In fact, a vegan and plant-based diet can grow 10,000 times as many calories on 1 acre of land as growing an animal. So if you look at the graph on the right, you see the plant-based foods are on the left and the animal-based foods are on the right. All the plant-based foods use far less land, use far less water, and produce far less emissions than the animal foods on the right. Look out for palm oil. As I mentioned, it can be found in so many things under various names. Skip fish oil and choose plant-based omega-3s instead. Alpha-linolenic acid is the plant-based omega-3, and it's found in walnut, chia, and flax, to name a few. You can also use algal, DHA and EPA, and algal meaning algae. Get it from the primary producers. Skip the middleman. Whenever possible, use multi-use products such as bags, coffee mugs, or others. I tend to like making bags on Shutterfly or other services. In fact, this is a bag that I made of my son when he was a little bit younger, instead of single-use plastic products. Create less food waste. Buy only what you will eat, compost what you will not, or what you cannot. Save leftovers for later with canning, jarring, or freezing. Repurpose, turn leftovers into a new or recooked recipe. Use less packaging, buy in bulk, shop at farmers markets, look into community supported agriculture, which is a CSA, and community gardens. That's a picture of our community garden here at UCLA from a year or two ago. And then refuse, reduce, or reuse and recycle your plastic whenever possible. Refuse the plastic, reuse what you can, and recycle what's left. Be mindful of the types of clothing and textiles you buy. It's actually the third most detrimental industry after fossil fuels and plastics and likely animal agriculture. It's made from plastic or petrochemicals, a lot of the clothing is, such as rayon, polyester, nylon, or spandex. And when washed, they may release millions of microscopic fibers into the ocean. It's better to buy clothing and textiles made out of natural materials such as cotton, silk, linen, and wool if you can find humane options. Look for fair trade and regenerative products. The image on the right is Rodale's regenerative agriculture symbol. And the beautiful thing about regenerative agriculture is that not only does it put more carbon into the soil, it removes it from the atmosphere, which is a wonderful way to avert global warming, but it actually grows more food on the same amount of land because you're feeding the soil, you're feeding the crops with all of that carbon and with moisture into the soil. So it's quite an amazing thing. And there's a fantastic movie called Kiss the Ground and a book of the same title that goes very much into this detail. And also remember, you are able to affect more change than you think. The most powerful action you can take as an individual right now is to change your eating habits to be more sustainable. This is far more impactful and far-reaching than changing all the light bulbs in your house or taking shorter showers. Vote for those who believe in climate change and the action that is needed today. Seek out fair trade, organic, and compostable products. Do your part and advocate and educate those around you as if this were an emergency, because it really is, and we really are running out of time to fix this. And just for your information, because of the important report that came out from the IPCC 2 days ago, the Conference of the Parties 26, COP26, is meeting in Glasgow this November. Their goal, as they stated, is to work with all countries involved to increase climate ambition, build resilience, and lower emissions. And I greatly hope that they make some really good progress on it, because the last time, the 2015 COP, unfortunately, they pledged to lower emissions and not a whole lot was done on that. So I really hope that they make some good progress this time. And I also hope that food and what you eat is on the menu. And also, just remember, the greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it. I encourage you to be that someone else and help us save it. And for more information and additional resources, I have a whole book on this called Recipe for Survival: What You Can Do to Live a Healthier and More Environmentally Friendly Life. It's available for pre-order right now on a bunch of websites. So if this talk resonated with you, and I certainly hope it did, you know, there's a ton more information where this came from inside this book. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and see if there's some questions in the chat.